The Battle of Bakhmut, the longest battle in the history of the 21st century thus far, has finally come to an end after 244 days of brutal fighting. Bakhmut has fallen to Russia's Wagner forces. Russia has won the city, Ukraine has lost the city. So is this a turning point in the Ukraine conflict? What does this victory mean for Russia? What does the loss mean for Ukraine and for Ukraine's long-promised spring offensive? What does the loss mean for Zelensky and for NATO and the US-led West? What are the implications of this development for India and for China and for the rest of the world? Please subscribe and let's find out. So this battle, the Battle of Bakhmut, began on the 1st of August 2022. Bakhmut had a pre-war population of about 70,000 people. Today the city is essentially flattened, it's destroyed, and we're not quite sure if anybody still survives there. Bakhmut has been critical to Russia's objective of taking the mineral-rich Donbas region. For example, very close to Bakhmut, in the town of Soledar, there are these very famous salt mines, massive salt mines, and there are gypsum mines as well in this region. So Bakhmut and Donbas region overall are a mineral-rich region, and Bakhmut is critical to taking Donbas for Russia. Now, most of the fighting on Russia's behalf has been done by the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is a Russian paramilitary organization. It has been described variously as a private military company, as a network of mercenaries, and also as a private army of the Russian President Putin. The founder of the Wagner Group is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He has in the past been called Putin's chef. That's because in the past, almost in a past life, he provided catering for the Kremlin. So he has been called in the past Putin's chef. Now Prigozhin has become in a way the central character in the Battle of Bakhmut. Now before the Ukraine war, the Wagner Group had about 5,000 fighters. These fighters were experienced former soldiers from Russia's elite regiments and special forces. The Wagner Group's first operation was helping Russia conquer Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. The Wagner Group has fought in Syria alongside Assad and its guarded oil fields in Syria. It's fought in Libya, supporting the forces loyal to General Khalifa Haftar. It's fought in the Central African Republic, guarding diamond mines. It's fought in Sudan, guarding gold mines. It's also fought in Mali, supporting the government of Mali in West Africa against militant groups. Today, the Wagner Group it commands about 50,000 soldiers, fighters in Ukraine, and it's been a key component of Russia's Ukraine campaign. About 80% of the Wagner Group's troops in Ukraine have been drawn from Russian prisons. There's a very famous viral Prigozhin video out there on social media in which he's promising convicts that they will be released from prison in return for a 6-month combat tour of Ukraine. So we'll take you out of prison, you're going to serve in the Wagner Group, you're going to be trained for a while, then you're going to go and fight in Ukraine for 6 months. Most likely you won't survive, but if you survive, then you will be freed, you'll be released from prison, and all of your criminal record, whatever, will all be released, will be erased. So this is kind of reminiscent of various Hollywood movies. Think of Vin Diesel, for example, that sort of thing. So like I said, the battle began on the 1st of August 2022. It turned very quickly into a brutal battle of attrition. By November, it was kind of reminiscent of the terrible battles, the horrible battles of World War I, Passchendaele, etc. And the media started terming it the Bakhmut meat grinder. Now, if you look at the Western media and their reporting over the past 244 days, they have portrayed Bakhmut as a town that has no strategic value. The Western media has said that Russia's attacks were pointless and Russia's attacks were strange. And they also said that the Wagner Group will never take Bakhmut. And they also portrayed the Wagner Group as essentially convicts with shovels. Now, in approximately mid-January this year, 2023, the town of Soledar, which lies to the northwest of Bakhmut, very close to Bakhmut, and which is famous for its salt mines, this town fell to the Wagner Group, and the Wagner Group and Prigozhin released videos from inside the salt mines. But Bakhmut remained a stalemate. Now let's fast forward a little and come to this month itself, May 2023. So around the 5th of May 2023, Prigozhin announced that his fighters of the Wagner Group will leave the city of Bakhmut on the 10th of May because of a critical, crippling shortage of ammunition. He said that the Wagner Group will finally leave Bakhmut. They are no longer in a position to fight because the Kremlin is not supplying it with sufficient ammunition. And Prigozhin released an apoplectic and scathing video showing a large number of dead Wagner soldiers. And in this video, he essentially excoriated the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Prigozhin was extremely critical of these two individuals, and he made liberal use of the B word and the S word. In case you have some familiarity with the Russian language, you will know what those words are. And after this happened, the head of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Akhmadovich Kadyrov, announced that his Chechen soldiers will replace Wagner in Bakhmut. So cracks were beginning to appear in the Russian military. There was apparently a loss of morale, and more importantly, President Vladimir Putin appeared to be on the verge of losing control of what was happening in Bakhmut and maybe in Ukraine. But by May 20, the Wagner Group had not only not withdrawn from Bakhmut, but they had cleared the last Ukrainian fighters, defenders, and they had won the battle after 224 days. So essentially, Prigozhin's announcement, his video, his apparent running out of ammunition, his apparent shooting of deserting Russian soldiers, his calling out of the Kremlin, his calling out of Shoigu and Gerasimov, his apparent confusion and loss of control, all of this was nothing but a masterful psy-op, psychological operation. This was an absolute masterclass in battlefield psy-ops. This will be studied in military colleges for decades to come. So this guy, Prigozhin, lured Ukraine's forces into the Bakhmut trap. He killed their generals, and he preempted Ukraine's long-promised spring counteroffensive. So in retaliation to this, Ukraine launched an abortive cross-border operation in Russia's Belgorod region. Apparently, this was done by Russian fighters aligned with Ukraine, anti-Putin Russian nationals. These are the people who apparently took part in this operation, and this operation was rather quickly neutralized by Russia, and it amounted to essentially nothing much, unfortunately for Ukraine. So that is what's happened. Bakhmut has finally fallen. Russia has won this town. The Ukrainians have lost. So the question is, first of all, what does this mean for Russia? Is this a big turning point in the Ukraine conflict? So from Russia's perspective, I would say that this is welcome news for Russia. The Western media has been claiming for over a year that Russia is losing. They have been saying this since essentially the beginning of the conflict. So clearly Russia has won this victory. Even now, the Western media is saying that Bakhmut has not really fallen and some Ukrainians are still fighting. But, well, I think the writing is very much on the wall. So Russia has won this city. It's a significant victory. It will clearly boost morale in the Russian military, armed forces, etc. Secondly, this operation, the Battle of Bakhmut, it has destroyed nearly half of Ukraine's brigades. Nearly half of Ukraine's brigades. These are irreplaceable losses for Ukraine, and they will severely hamper future Ukrainian resistance. And you don't have to say this, but it's clearly going to cause a tremendous loss of morale in the Ukrainian military. And most likely, because of all of this, the spring offensive that has been promised for months, and they're announcing it will happen anytime, this spring offensive will most likely not happen. So it is advantage Russia from this perspective. Is this a turning point in the war? I don't think it's quite a turning point in the war. Russia is still fighting a defensive war. Russia is not going all out. It's not utilizing its actual proper military. It's using auxiliary forces like Wagner. It's hardly using its air force at all. So Russia is still fighting a very defensive, conservative war. So I don't think it's a turning point from my perspective thus far in the war, in the Ukraine war. Now, what does this loss of the city, what does it mean for Ukraine? So like I said, Ukraine has suffered catastrophic, irreplaceable losses. Nearly half of their brigades have been destroyed in the Bakhmut meat grinder. This will severely hamper future Ukrainian resistance, against future Russian advances. And like I said, the spring offensive is most likely not going to happen. What does it mean for Zelensky and his leadership? So the West has invested a lot into building Zelensky's image as a great hero, as a Che Guevara-like figure. And they will not write off their investment so quickly, so easily. Bakhmut, the loss of Bakhmut was not Zelensky's fault. He takes his orders from above, from outside Ukraine, from the West. So he's still quite useful for the West, and I expect that that Zelensky will survive, at least for now, and he will continue on as the president of Ukraine. What does the loss of Bakhmut to Russia mean for NATO and the US-led West? So from their perspective, from the Western perspective, from the NATO's perspective, from the US perspective, this is not a big deal. Ukraine is essentially a disposable asset for the West, for NATO, for the US. Russia, from their perspective, from the big picture perspective, is still contained in the Donbass region. It's not gone beyond that. Even if Russia manages to take the whole of Ukraine, Russia is still contained in Eastern Europe. See, the West's ultimate objective is to inflict what Putin calls a strategic defeat on Russia. In essence, the West wants to effect regime change in Moscow and or the Balkanization of Russia. That's their objective, and the loss of a city like Bakhmut doesn't really, mean much from that perspective, from the big picture perspective. Obviously, they'll be concerned. Obviously, they will not be happy that Russia has been able to succeed in this 244-day battle. But overall, it's still advantage NATO. So Russia is still on the defensive. They're still relying on Wagner, and they're still relying on auxiliary paramilitary forces like Wagner. They're still keeping their regular forces in reserve. They're still keeping essentially their entire air force in reserve. So overall, if we look at the big picture, it's not a big loss for the West. It's still advantage West from the big picture perspective. What does this mean for India? So in the short term, it doesn't mean much. It's still business as usual from India's perspective. In the long run, if Russia survives the war and emerges stronger in the long run, this will lead to the emergence of a multipolar world, which will be good for India and for the non-Western world, essentially for the global South. So from the short-term perspective, it's business as usual for India. It doesn't really affect India much. What does this mean for China? So just like India, in the short term, it means nothing much. It's business as usual. In the long run, if Russia survives the war but emerges weaker in the long run, it's great for China. But if Russia emerges stronger in the long run, it is going to be bad news for China, because then China will not be able to pull Russia into a vassal state or client state relationship. China's great dream or ambition is to turn Russia into a client state, and thus far they have not succeeded in doing this. So if Russia emerges weaker in the long run, China will be able to do that, and that will be great for China. Now, if Russia loses the war, that's a disaster for China. That's going to be a disaster for China, because if Russia loses, then China is going to be next in the crosshairs of the West, of the US, right? So that's the deal with China. And what does this mean for the rest of the world? So once again, in the short term, it means nothing much. It's business as usual. But if Russia survives the war and true multipolarity emerges in the long run, it is good for the global South. That's my analysis. Now, I'm sure that people in the West will not like this analysis. I mean, Russia is the bad guy. How can you say such things? Russia must lose, all that. So the West must understand a few things. The world's population is 7.8 billion. The Western world, from its broadest definition, has a population of 1.2 billion. So the West must understand that the West is a very small entity in the global perspective. It is still the most powerful entity, but that's okay. The West's problems are not the rest of the world's problems. The West's priorities are not the rest of the world's priorities. And the West's values are not the rest of the world's values. The West has ruled the world for about 5 centuries, but it is now in decline, and the East is rising. The East does not need the West to teach us what's right and what's wrong. We don't need lessons and lectures on morality from the West. And the East is under no obligation to keep following the West's lead. The East will make its own choices. So that is the situation in Bakhmut. Those are the implications from my perspective for the world and for India. And we're going to keep a very close watch on this situation and examine and analyze it as and when something significant happens. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.